Alrighty. Is anyone not ready? Cool.
One sec. Just one sec.
Yep, no worries.
So aim, con, right? First
Ah.
paper. I am.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm ready.
Alright, sounds good. Cary affirms resolve. The United States federal government should increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. The West Asian region is on fire, and the United States is the only one with the tools to put it out. Our sole contention is...
Sorry for the interruption. My tab room says this is Lambert is pro and Cary is con.
Oh, I think you're able to change it.
I don't think that's, I think that's.
Yeah, let me check ours.
Which is why I was
Ours
a little
says
confused and I was trying to.
Yeah,
Lambert should be on the con speaking second.
And that's why I was checking when I was checking the SMS that we get.
Glad we caught that.
Yeah, that
Should we maybe try to call in someone from tab?
we should. Because if I submit one way, it gets confusing because I have to submit the winning team as well as the pro con, and I don't know what I can do, right? So what are you guys saying? You're con.
We're pro, they're con.
On our tab room?
Okay, yeah, you're pro, they're con. It's the other way around.
Yeah.
I think I noticed it. I thought it was like a mistake.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't mean to you're all good. I just out of curiosity.
No. I mean,
Who are you in relation to?
Tab room is,
I'm just
Scrap.
starting for this
Oh.
one since I was here, like
Tab room, what's
volunteering
your
all day, I thought I'd
name as a
check
judge?
I got you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't blame you.
How do I spell
know
that?
this is crazy things anymore. Like, why would you want to be
No,
here?
you're good. It's just it's always interesting. Someone will be scouting, someone will be from another team, someone will be the coach, someone will be.
I am none of the above.
No,
I'm
you're
just,
all good.
Like Miss Nobody, just taking a break so the judges know.
Thank you.
Okay, so what's the problem?
Yeah.
She's actually here to talk about
Someone from tab just texted me, they said maybe to try refreshing.
Okay.
maybe as simple as that. Sorry about that then.
Okay.
It's fixed.
Okay.
It's fixed. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Alright, cool. Alright, is anyone not ready? Alright. Then time will begin on my first word. Cary affirms resolve. The United States federal government should increase diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. The West Asian region is on fire, and the United States is the only one with the tools to put it out. Our sole contention is fighting the flames. Increasing diplomacy extinguishes two major conflicts. First is a Kurdish combustion. Since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, the Syrian Kurds, with territory and Turkish border, have been one of the most important players. Gestel 22 explains that Kurdish forces seized territory in northeastern Syria in 2011, from which it became the US's most reliable partner in counterterrorism. Turkey, however, labeled the group as insurgents, viewing the occupied territory as a national threat. As a result, Turkey is planning an incursion into Syria. Fraser writes on December 10th that after weeks of deadly Turkish airstrikes against the Kurds, Turkey continues to warn of a new land incursion to drive Kurdish groups away from the Turkey-Syrian border. Unfortunately, the US has turned a blind eye to the incursion. Jeffrey 22 writes that as a result of the United States' pivot away from West Asia, the Turkey-US coordination on Syria has fallen by the wayside. Thankfully, increased US diplomacy could quell Turkey's fears. Jeffrey writes that to prevent a destabilizing Turkish incursion, US officials could build on a past three-way Turkey-US Kurd arrangements to meet Turkey's immediate demands of Kurdish forces pulling away from Turkish territory. Empirically, the US successfully negotiated with Kurdish forces to meet these conditions in 2019. Fortunately, satellite confirms that the negotiated withdrawal of Kurdish forces effectively ended Turkish aggression in 2019. There are two impacts. First, a Syrian spark. A Turkish incursion would escalate the conflict and destroy vital infrastructure. Lambert 22 quantifies that 5 million people will be displaced as a result. Second is igniting ISIS. The Syrian Kurds were one of our greatest allies in the fight against terror. Consequently, Mendel 22 explains that the Turkish invasion could overwhelm Kurdish forces who incarcerate more than 10,000 ISIS prisoners, giving ISIS the opportunity to escape and resume operations. That would be devastating. Rain 18 concludes that preventing tourism and robbing countries of oil revenue, ISIS devastates all West Asian economies. The second conflict is Houthi heat. Violence in Yemen is escalating. Al-Hajj 22 explains that with the failure to extend a ceasefire between warring sides, heightened tension threatened to reignite the bloody civil war after a 6-month lapse. Indeed, over the past 2 months, Al-Rasser 22 warns that the Houthi militia has launched several drone attacks against Yemen. However, the US has failed to fully utilize diplomacy. Murphy 21 explains that America has yet to supplement diplomatic efforts by properly using its leverage with involved parties to end the war. Thankfully, increased diplomacy ends the conflict by bringing both sides of the conflict, the Iran-backed Houthis and the Saudi coalition forces, to the table. Nassif 18 explains that the US not only has the leverage to pressure Saudi Arabia to work towards an agreement, but also has the ability to pressure European allies to bring Iran and the Houthis to the negotiating table. Beyond using its allies, the US can directly pressure the Houthis. Johnson 121 furthers that the US can reconfigure sanctions on the Houthis' military commanders and economic engagements to reduce the funding the group uses to support its war efforts. Johnson continues that simply the threat of such sanctions could compel the Houthis to negotiate. This diplomacy has two impacts. First is the short term. Yang 21 warns that we can create conditions through US diplomacy to arrange for a ceasefire. Fortunately, Katanza 22 writes that an immediate nationwide ceasefire would protect civilians and facilitate the delivery of much needed aid. Unfortunately, Yerk 2022 explains that right now, 17 million people face food insecurity, with millions risking starvation. Second is the long term. Grant 21 writes that only the United States, with its partners, has the leverage to end the war. By building on unilateral efforts to push forward multilateral steps, the US can finally address the underlying drivers of the crisis. Ending the war ends the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Both women argue that if the war in Yemen continues through 2030, 9.2 million people will experience malnutrition, 22.2 million people will be forced into poverty, and 1.3 million people will die. Thus, to put out the fire, affirm.
All right, good. You don't need to say anything. Oh, you can finish saying it. I think we're okay. There we go. Bobby Michelle, Lambert negation. Anybody not ready? Varnica and I negate. Our sole contention is instability. David 16 finds that US brokered peace in the Middle East is a quixotic quest, as when it comes to the core identities from Jerusalem or social engineering in Syria, the US doesn't have the pull. Bakar 22 furthers that despite substantial investment, peace remains elusive and negotiations resemble haggling over goods. The peace process is likely to reinforce oppression, dehumanization, and violence. United States diplomatic involvement has spelled disaster for West Asia, and that effort increasing would only foster instability in a few ways. The first of which is economic tyranny. Currently, Trudeau 22 explains that Gulf Arab states like Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait look to partially privatize investments that constitute safe investment opportunities and strengthen their fiscal positions to invest in economic diversification measures. U.S. involvement accelerates and crashes that process. As Han 22 explains, that U.S. diplomats are facing new legal pressures to open markets wherever they're stationed around the world. Indeed, the Watt 08 ultimately finds that Iraq's political economic dependence on the United States prevents it from achieving autonomous development and democracy extolled in contemporary US policy when we try to do it there. That's why Hassan 18 explains that due to a flood of goods into Iraqi markets, GDP remains sluggish. Thus, it's no surprise that Market Watch puts over 20 million people in poverty in Iraq today, despite US diplomatic nation-building efforts. Repeating that situation would be disastrous. Our second argument is crowding out productive actors. Middle East Institute 23 explains that American behavior in West Asia is increasingly influenced by trends in Chinese-American relations. Middle Eastern countries are feeling growing pressure to join efforts to contain China, but that comes at a big cost to them. As Kubo 22 writes, that China offers economic opportunities and plans for achieving stability by stopping geopolitical rivalries, Iranian non-proliferation, combating terrorism, and developing the region. China criticizes the US zero-sum approach to diplomacy. Zero-summism is why US diplomacy has failed. As the CSIS 22 explains, at the last thing the United States wants to pursue was slow process of compromise and will always choose the hardest line initiative to avoid the question of losing. Thus, China has been a champion of effective diplomacy, as 10 to 22 furthers that Beijing has been careful in building its influence by managing the regional fault lines. For Iran, like the Gulf, China offers an alternative to its dealings with the West. Thus, increasing our cooperation is now reflected in forums such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Jahardi 20 adds that a policy of Saudi Arabia-Iran engagement could better be facilitated by China than even the United States. That's why Mazarki 22 quantifies that 13 million Yemenis are headed for starvation due to civil conflict. Relief Web 22 reports that in Syria, 12.4 million people suffer from food insecurity. Someone needs to do something about it, and that actor is China. But our third argument is inhibiting regional organizations. as Ani22 explains that the retreat of the US from West Asia led Gulf states to mend relations with their rivals. This increased prospects for stability, as Shaw23 explains that the region's leaders are increasingly trying to mediate and resolve political conflicts instead of turning to international actors. US diplomacy would fracture this progress, as Langs22 explains that Iran might be what the United States defines as a rival, but GCC countries have normal diplomatic relations with Iran. Saudi Arabia has conducted 5 rounds of negotiations with Iran regarding de-escalation. No Middle Eastern country identifies with the US same threat perceptions. The GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council, is now de-escalating tensions with neighboring countries. It's impossible to forge cooperation without consensus on threats with regional actors. Furthermore, the Middle East Institute 23 finds that Biden is not the first American leader to propose and fail to rebalance over-reliance on the military toward greater use of diplomacy. Using one policy instead of another to achieve the same goal is pretty difficult. That's why Velasco 13 concludes that regional organizations are 6.7 times more likely to keep peace, outperforming individual states. To date, Middle East conflicts have killed millions because of failed US diplomacy. Give peace a chance, the game. You ready for us?
Yeah. Can I get some evidence?
Oh, yeah. Sure.
We can just set up an email chain if that's all right with you.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want me to do that first, actually?
Huh?
Do you want to do that first?
Yeah. Here, I'll just bring.
Okay, cool, yeah.
It is sure.
Ahead of time, what's the evidence I could kind of just get?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Can I get the evidence on economic tyranny? The first, just that they're like, just diversifying right now, and then the second about U.S. officials opening markets.
Sure.
Perfect.
I'll grab that in a second. Okay. I just sent the email chain out. Let me know if you'll get that.
I've got the test email. Well, you don't think that.
Sure.
Yeah, I got the test too.
No, okay, I got privatization now.
Cool.
And then the other one was just that the United States is going to force it, right? Yep. It was just.
Pardon? Since we started first, do you mind if I take the first question?
Yeah, as always. On your first word.
Yep. So let's talk about this econ tyranny subpoint. When have we seen, what country have we seen the United States use diplomats to force their way through economically?
Yeah, so Iraq's a perfect example, and that's the one we talk about in case, right? After, Iraq was trying to restructure its economy, the United States came in with its diplomats, and it tried to, originally paint the situation as working with Iraq to restructure their economy, when in reality, what US diplomats did is they were legally required to force open Iraqi, markets, causing rapid privatization and liberalization,
Sure. So when was
which
this?
meant that US corporations were able to flood their markets and it crashed their economy. With that, let's take a look at your...
Really quickly, when was that? When was the Iran thing?
When was the Iran thing? Well, it was obviously over the course of several years when the market crash happened. It wasn't specifically one individual policy. With that, let's take a look at your Yemen argument.
Sure.
The United States diplomacy is so spectacular. They've been involved in the Yemen crisis for the past 8 years. Why haven't they solved it yet?
Sure, so let's talk about our Murphy 21 evidence, which tells you that the US is ineffectively using its current diplomacy by not properly using its leverage to end the war. The idea is that the United States is doing lazy sanctions, as we call it. They're not heavily invested in the region, so they're just applying these broad net sanctions on the Houthis. Obviously that isn't working as we've seen it. They aren't creating definitive progress and they aren't able to successfully crack down on the Houthis' funding. When we say you increase diplomacy, the United States' focus on the region increases substantially. So we can say that when the United States diplomacy increases substantially, they focus sanctions specifically on the Houthis' top military commanders and specifically their funding as well to halt the Houthis running their tracks.
So let's agree on two things real quick. One, your
2, 1. Okay.
That's 30 seconds. Alright. This is just going to be a little bit of impact comparison at the very top, and then it'll be responding to their case. Is anyone not ready? Then time will begin on my first word. Judge, the thesis of our case is really simple. A fire is raging in West Asia, and the United States is the only one who can quell it. But even if you buy 100% of their case, let's weigh like your paradigm tells us to, because we are outweighing our probability. We know that conflicts are ongoing right now in the region. We know that violence increases in places like Yemen, and we know the only chance of solving them is when we actually increase diplomacy and put them to an end. But let's go to their case. At the top, they say that the United States doesn't have the leverage, and negotiations are always failing. But our argument is that we are changing our policy right now empirically. Miller explains that Biden is changing his policy in order to include regional actors more and to have them play the main role in the region. We are becoming the platform instead of butting headfirst into conflicts. This applies to a lot of their case about us promoting economic tyranny and crowding actors when we are the one facilitating these dialogues, not necessarily butting in. But on their first thing about economic tyranny, one, this doesn't have anything to do with the resolution. The resolution is about us going in and solving internal armed conflicts. There is no argument that this has to do with increasing our access to markets, making sure they're more capitalist or anything like that. But second, their own evidence says these countries want to diversify and want to become more privatized anyway. The United States is actually using its expertise to make sure that these countries do it in a better way. They give me this empiric about Iraq and how it crashed their economy. This was empirically after the US went in with military forces and crashed their economy because of the invasion. It's not because of diversification. Our argument is that the only way to actually stop these crashes is moving away from military forces and towards diplomacy, which puts out the fire. But on their second point about crowding out productive actors, we take a lot of issue with the term of productive. China is not a productive actor in the region. First, China is going to export its authoritarian model of governance into the region. Decknatel 22 writes that China's expansion of soft power in West Asia seeks to export a Chinese model of internet control, surveillance, and disinformation to regimes in the Arab world eager to follow. China has been remarkably successful, indeed. Yaya 22 explains that as a result of increased Chinese engagement, West Asia is experiencing an unprecedented autocratic resurgence. Unfortunately, this increases the chance of internal armed conflict. Rosto 5 explains it increases the chance of civil war by 16 times when you have a repressive authoritarian regime. But second, really importantly, when you let China have more impact in the region, it enables genocides, like the Uyghur genocide. Hardeen 21 explains that as China deepens relations in West Asia, many states are actively assisting Beijing in its global genocide of Uyghur Muslims. At least 6 governments in the Arab world have detained or extradited Uyghurs at China's behest. Sector 22 quantifies that more than 1,500 Uyghur Muslims have been deported to China to face imprisonment and brutal torture. You are affirming at face value because you want to push out genocide. You have a moral value to stop that. But third, we would say that China doesn't want to get its hands dirty. It doesn't want to go into the region and actually solve these conflicts. It takes a very non-interventionist approach, which is why it's never empirically solved a conflict, but it has empirically spread authoritarianism. But fourth, we would say U.S. diplomacy is a lot better. Empirically, it succeeded in places like Yemen in creating a platform. It succeeded with the Israel-Palestine conflict in creating the Abraham Accords. It sent tens of millions of dollars of aid to Syria. The argument is that we need to do it more. But let's go to the third convention about regionalism. They say it's 6.7 times more likely to solve peace when we have regional actors. Our argument is that regionalism doesn't exist without the United States. Our Heller 20 evidence indicates that states in the Arab world simply do not trust each other. There is a lack of trust between institutions and governments, which is why every single time regionalism is tried, it empirically falls apart. Their argument that the GCC has fallen apart every single couple of years because of embargoes by certain nations. Because of a lack of trust, it always goes away. In fact, you can turn it, because the only way you see regionalism is with the United States. Miller 20 writes that U.S. diplomacy can be calibrated carefully to empower local actors pushing for change. recognizing that they and not outside actors must be the central players in West Asia. Vietnam 20 of Foreign Policy confirms the United States should push for the establishment of a structural regional dialogue. Conversations would be held with U.S. support, but with no Americans present. In fact, this is empirically what is happening right now, what we are shifting to right now. Stark 21 explains that Saudi Houthi talks are what we are currently pushing for and what we are currently creating in Yemen. They have happened so far. They say there are Saudi and Iranian talks by themselves. We argue they literally fell apart in December because there are protests in Iran. That proves our point. There is a lack of trust between governments, so these discussions, these regional dialogues make no progress. In order to put out the fire that has been raging through West Asia, affirm.
Judge, just for your reference, I'm going to be going down my opponent's case, and then my partner will defend our case in the next speech. Is everyone ready? Okay, awesome. The thesis of my opponent's case is that the United States diplomacy is some golden ticket that's going to restore decades of conflict that's happened in the Middle East. But unfortunately, we have to take a more realistic approach. Let's start with their first argument about Turkey. First off, there's 3 really logical reasons why Turkey simply won't invade. First, Turkey's economy is on the border of collapse between COVID and sanctions. This is really important because when a country doesn't have money, is it going to risk all of its political stability and go to war? No. We'd say, quite frankly, what the officials are doing and what their evidence draws from is officials making a statement to just kind of create a smoke and mirrors effect and kind of create the idea that they'll invade to get political gains. So unfortunately, my opponent's argument isn't true in practice, which is why Turkey hasn't invaded thus far. But furthermore, we'd say they wouldn't want to risk backlash from international actors. After Russia invaded Ukraine, they were devastated. Why would Turkey want to put themselves in the same situation? It's simply not worth the risk. Furthermore, they wouldn't risk angering their main ally, Russia, who's currently said, according to CNN, no, Turkey, we don't want you to invade. Our troops are in the region. We want to reject conflict. So they wouldn't go against their allies and wouldn't go against basic logic and harm their economy. But second of all, let's look at their historical example of the United States mediating in the past. What fundamentally happened there and why the United States was able to successfully mediate was because we had troops in the region. We signed the deal and did the negotiations prior to withdrawing from Syria. Now let me tell you why that's important here. First, that meant we had leverage on Turkey to convince them to do something, but second, we were there for the Kurds to reassure them. But that's not the case today. With no troops in the region, having already sanctioned Turkey, and quite frankly, no real ability to enforce anything, we don't have the power that we once did. Conversely, we would say actors like Russia, according to the Guardian evidence, are already in the region mediating. There is no reason why the United States is suddenly key when all of our benefits are gone. But lastly, let's consider this impact scenario of innovation. We would say other actors have just as much of an incentive, like NATO and the EU, to step in and defend this area, preventing genocide. But on the idea of terror, this is where their case falls apart even further. We would say that the United States, along with regional actors, have already put so many counter-terror measures in place that they would stop it. But most importantly, ISIS has no funding. We've crushed them, the Middle East themselves has crushed them. Without any economy, it doesn't matter who gets released, they simply can't take action. But let's go to their next argument about Houthis. This case starts with a misunderstanding of what's happening today. You can look to the Con 22 evidence that tells you that despite the ceasefire falling apart, conflict levels have not returned anywhere near what they once were. This is important because this shows you that countries are de-escalating. However, when you put the United States back into the region, this worsens things for a couple of logical reasons. First comes from Shailene that talks about how the US does diplomacy. What they tell you is that because the United States always tells the Houthis, hey, we won't compromise, it's our security, and gives them the harshest conditions, the Houthis can never agree to a long-term agreement. We have to give some and take some, right? Because that's how compromise works. But that's not what the United States does. But second, we don't have any way to pressure these countries anymore. They talk about sanctioning specific Houthi leaders. We've been doing that since 2021, yet nothing has changed. They talk about, pushing Saudi Arabia to the table. We already give them arms. There's no more carrots we can offer them. What's left to do? And now the Houthis' funding source, Iran, we've sanctioned them so much that the Carmen evidence tells you their leaders have found ways around sanctions. There's no leverage. We create so much anti-US sentiment that no one wants to come to the table. But most importantly, let's look at what's happening today. Iran and Saudi Arabia, using structures that already exist, are conducting diplomacy. My opponents might tell you, well, the US created that framework. That doesn't matter because today, without US involvement, without someone telling them, hey, you have to hate each other and live by US ideals, they're conducting diplomacy. So don't change a peaceful status quo.
You ready for cross?
Yes, absolutely.
Wait, can you take 5 seconds?
Oh, sure. We're gonna take 5 seconds.
Okay, starting 3, 2.
Okay. That was the second.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
We just got this.
Since you spoke first, you're welcome to take the first question whenever you're ready.
Cool, thank you. Okay. You say that Turkey's economy is on the brink of collapse. What evidence says that?
So we just say that Turkey's economy
Wait,
is
so you
like,
just
doing
assert
pretty
that?
poorly. Huh?
You just assert that Turkey's economy is on the brink of collapse.
No,
That
I mean
means
there's a
evidence.
lot of evidence that says that.
Like
I
what?
can I honestly don't know the author off
Okay.
the top of my head, but like Turkey's economy hasn't been doing great, and that's a large part of why Erdogan, their president, is concerned about his re-election.
But that's something you have to prove, right? That's an
yeah, of
argument you
course.
have to,
We
like,
can send
actually
you a
give
piece of evidence if you'd like to see it.
Okay.
Okay,
question.
awesome. So let's talk about your argument concerning the Houthis. So what I'm a little bit concerned about is your partner kind of comes up here and gives us the notion that, we need to sanction these officials specifically, and that's what's going to make all the difference.
Yeah.
But given that we've been sanctioning, a bunch of military commanders that we thought were the highest time and time again with the given intel we had, why, what would change now?
It looks like there's a pattern here, right? You're asserting a lot of things. A lot of these don't have evidence. Our Johnson
The
evidence,
U.S. Treasury evidence, I'd be glad
our
to provide
Johnson
it
evidence
for
from
you.
2021 indicates we haven't been sanctioning the top commanders. We have only been doing indiscriminate sanctions on the entire group. But the Johnson evidence indicates that when we put actual, more diplomatic focus towards the region, we target their commanders. We target their funding sources. We aren't doing that right now. That's what the Johnson evidence
Yeah.
indicates, and you don't actually provide an alternate that says, we're already doing all of these
So
things.
I'd love
Can I
to
see the
show you a
question?
U.S. Treasury report that says otherwise, right?
Okay, show me
Between Biden and Trump, through all of 2021, we've been sanctioning not only the military commanders themselves, but anyone that we thought was maybe even financing the Houthis, which I think kind of indicates that we've done all that we can.
Except
But you're
that's,
welcome to take a
not true
question.
at all. We haven't been doing that, but yeah, I'll take a question. Okay, so you say that there's the Iran and the Saudi Arabian talks. What happened to those talks?
Yeah, so I think you're right that the talks were paused because of protests, but what's important is that our evidence from less than a month ago indicates that they have every intention to keep going with those talks, and most importantly, our Zhang evidence tells you that through those talks they were able to de-escalate tensions and calm the flames that you
But that's
keep
not what
asserting are
happened,
there.
right? Your evidence from a month ago, from whenever it was, says they were going to make progress. Then they fell apart. They weren't making progress after they fell apart. They haven't
That's
suddenly
true.
resumed
The
these
talks
They were
have been
literally-
about, okay.
The talks don't exist anymore.
So I think that when talks were paused, less than a week
Talks
ago,
were ended.
of course they're not. No, they were paused. I can give you evidence that says they were paused. But most importantly, the fact that they've been talking about de-escalating tensions is quite frankly really important, right? Because these adversaries, or those so we thought the United States framed them to be, weren't coming to talks by themselves for such a long time. But the fact that the minute the United States wasn't constantly butting their head, they were willing to discuss and brainstorm ways to de-escalate tensions is important.
Because that's
I think
not
the
true.
idea that talks are supposed to accomplish something in just a month is quite frankly not very realistic, right? What country is supposed to solve huge
Except that's
ideological
not true, though.
differences
There
for
have-
a month?
There have been regional talks with the United States, or how evidence indicates. There always have been regional talks while the United States is there, but they
Awesome.
fall apart not because of the United States, but because there is a fundamental lack of trust between the agencies.
And this trust,
Which is
our
why-
evidence indicates,
Can I
is
finish?
fostered
Which is
by the
why
United States
the Iran
telling them
and
to
Saudi
villainize
Arabian
each
talks
other.
fell apart and have not resumed. But yeah, that's fine.
Y'all gonna use one?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll take some breath.
Oh shoot. That's
okay.
awkward. Yeah, I'm just gonna stand up away from my paper. Is my paper?
Okay, we're gonna put some breath. That'll start.
Yo, wait, do you want scissors?
Yeah, actually, yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah.
Do I need that? Or yeah. Oops.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, it's gonna be hard to
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. We're actually starting prep now. Oh, sorry. Can we get U.S. Treasury evidence?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, and can we also have the Iran gone around sanctions?
Iran got her, yes, for sure.
Cool.
Wait, yeah, that's it. Should be.
Okay, so there's two
cards for you for the. There's 2 cards on the Houthi stuff. Sorry, the words just weren't coming.
It's been a long
Is that the
day.
right one? Durham round 6 also.
Oh, sorry. I know you want me to. Can I get the evidence that says that the talks decrease violence between Saudi and Iran?
It's that they're working to de-escalate conflict. Can you get that? Oh. Okay. So just to make sure, it was the evidence about the Houthis getting sanctioned and then the Iran circumvented sanctions,
Yeah.
right?
And then think about
Cool, awesome. Let me just copy paste it.
talks de-escalate.
Gotcha.
Sorry, you know how the Wi-Fi is.
I know.
It's not as bad as it was the first day.
It actually is better now, I think.
Yeah,
Like,
the first day
like,
it was off.
I was using my hotspot. I couldn't use it at all.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, it was just sent.
Cool.
There's like a weird amount of spacing between the Houthi cards and the Iran thing, but if you like scroll, I promise it's there.
You know the piece of evidence.
What
It's
did they
not.
ask for?
It's not in. It's like laying something.
Oh, yeah, I
Five
got it.
blocks.
I can
It's
get
not
that.
the rigid block.
Did you get Adam yet?
I got the.
I'm sending the other
First
email
two,
now.
yeah,
Bobby
first
can find
two.
the.
Do you mind telling us like where in the paragraph like you?
Literally the first 2 lines of both of them say that we, you know.
Okay, just first 2 lines?
just-
Okay, cool.
Like the lines just say it, yeah. And then I got the. Okay, cool. Everything was just sent. Are y'all running prep?
Okay, we're
Yes.
Okay, 3.
Now start now.
Okay, I think that's it.
So I took about 30 seconds. What else? A minute 45. So we have 45 seconds left.
Last speech of the day.
Yep. Alright, so it's gonna be pretty simple. Just talking about our case, their case, and some comparisons at the end if I have some time. The West Asian region is on fire, and the US is the only one with the tools to put it out. That is why you're voting for a subpoint about a Houthi heat. What's happening right now? Violence in Yemen is rapidly escalating as the US is ineffectively using diplomacy without leverage to properly end the war. However, the U.S. could solve. The threat of U.S. reconfiguring sanctions on the Houthis to freeze the negotiations forces them to the negotiating table. But why does this all matter? The impact is in the long term. Bolton explains that 1.3 million people die and 22.2 million people go into poverty if the Yemen conflict extends till 2030. At the end of the day, our opponents have a few responses, but none of them really hold up. First, say that conflict levels are still low and that countries are currently de-escalating. This is simply not true, as we give you all Raster 22 evidence describes that conflict is rapidly escalating as the Houthis are currently bombing Saudi Arabia and coalition forces and Yemen. But next they say that the U.S. can tell the U.S. can't tell the Houthis to back off anymore and that they need to have some sort of cooperation. Here's the issue: when the U.S. sanctions their Houthis and funding and stops it completely, the Houthis have two choices. One, they can either go to the negotiating table, or two, they can fizzle out into non-existence. Because here's the issue: if you don't have any money, you can't have a war. If you don't have any leaders, you can't lead a military to have a war. They have no other option but to cooperate. But then they say we've already been putting sanctions on the Houthis and they haven't been effective. Our Johnson 21 card is incredibly specific. It tells you that the United States has not placed any sanction on the Houthis' economic engagements and sources of funding. Their card just tells you that the U.S. has sanctioned maybe one guy here, maybe another guy here, but it hasn't really been specific and it hasn't been working. Our Johnson card also accounts for this by telling you that the U.S. currently only sanctions mid-tier Houthi leaders. What changes when you affirm? When you affirm, the United States starts sanctioning the funding, freezes it. The U.S. starts sanctioning top-level leaders, ending military leader that the Houthis have. But then they say that Saudi Arabia is we've already given up all of our leverage. We would say no, Saudi Arabia is incredibly economically reliant on the U.S. The U.S. has tons of leverage there. But then they say Iran's getting around sanctions. Iran isn't even giving the Houthis weapons anymore. We would say it's because they're dealing with a massive domestic crisis and large-scale protests. But let's go to their side of the debate, where they concede too much to actually win. First, at the top, Miller 20 explains that Biden is empowering regional actors, creating a platform for successful dialogue. Remember, the U.S. is why you can see regional actors succeed. The U.S. is the reason why regional actors are 7 times more effective. We don't see that platform until the U.S. provides it. But let's go specifically on econ, tyranny. Their own evidence says that these countries were going to open up their markets and privatize them. It's really bad. The U.S. was only there to help facilitate it and make sure that they opened up properly. But then let's go to their the second argument about pushing actors away. We would say that China is not a good actor. China is currently exporting authoritarian values, which is why we've seen West Asia have the highest amount of authoritarian levels. These countries are helping China export their own genocides, helping murder and genocide the Uyghur Muslims. But specifically on diplomacy, they concede our Heller 20 evidence, which tells you that regional institutes don't trust each other. Miller 20 says that this is really important because U.S. diplomacy calibrates to regional actors to help them in the first place, as we've empirically seen in Syria and Iran. You're going to weigh this on probability. If you don't trust your neighbors, you aren't going to have successful diplomacy. You aren't going to be able to negotiate them. Only the U.S. brings them to the table.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out just which piece of evidence I needed. Oh, can I see your uniqueness evidence on Yemen escalating right now?
Yeah, sure. Okay, Al-Hajj talks about directly after the ceasefire. Al-Rasser talks about with the bombings. If this enters. Okay, the format might be weird, but everything's highlighted. Yeah.
I will let you know as soon as we get that.
Al-Hajj and Sarah?
Al-Rasser, yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Next we'll start this one up front.
No, I'm good. Did we use prep earlier? No, okay, awesome. So we'll start our 3 minutes of prep beginning now.
Cool. Smart.
That's our next one.
Oh no, I need my laptop. Okay. Order of the speech. I guess we'll go our case and their case. Does anybody know? Cool. So. Listen, when it comes down to it, the United States caused the fire. They've been in the leaders for the past 20 years. We say that when you affirm, you only fan the flames. Let's talk about it. Our regionalism argument is really, really simple. We tell you, well, West Asian allies are moving towards regional cooperation instead of relying on the United States via things like the Gulf Cooperation Council. Forcing the United States to get involved like you do in an affirmative world in negotiations disrupts that process. It realigns allies from focusing on things like stability and working towards peace with countries that go on, to treating power sharing like a threat and focusing on short-term gains like the United States historically does. Fortunately, regional organizations are 6.7 times better at maintaining long-term peace, meaning U.S. diplomacy risks sacrificing the end of proxy conflicts that have plagued the Middle East for years and put millions at risk. Listen, you don't have to be one of our many experts to understand the idea that for the past 2 decades, the United States has had their chance, and they've been in charge. And if you think things are going well in terms of conflict, then yeah, sure, maybe you should affirm to increase what has failed time and time again, but I don't think you do. With that, the only sort of response they actually try to make on our case is this idea that Biden creates diplomacy and other countries don't trust each other, so the United States is key. Here's the problem. That once again misses the mark with not only the idea of this regionalism, but also what is happening right now. They don't specifically tell you what countries don't trust each other and how Biden is key, but what we do know is that the United States has already done their part to help set up the GCC itself. Now that they're already together, keeping the United States involved means that these countries have to align with the United States security cooperation, meaning they treat countries like Iran as an enemy instead of sitting down at the negotiating table and actually making concessions. That's how real negotiations get done. That's how peace ultimately is achieved. We say that things are already working right now, absent the United States involvement. You know that Iran and Saudi Arabia, for the first time ever, came together for over 5 individual peace talks. Sure, they were paused for a time because Iran had to deal with something completely separate. Of course, they're always, they're never going to be perfect. 2 decades of violence that the United States caused can't be undone overnight. But you know that that's a clear signal that regionalism is beginning to work now that the United States is no longer stubbing itself in the region and trying to direct things for U.S. interests. With that, you can take a look at their arguments. The sentiment is the exact same here. The United States not doing a whole lot. We tell you as much as they go for this specific, Yemenis argument compared to solving the tons of proxy conflicts that regionalism potentially could. Even if we look at the Yemen argument, you're probably not voting on it. We say that 1, look to the United States Treasury evidence directly from us. That postdates their evidence about sanctions. The United States has already used up all the leverage it possibly has to bring the Houthi rebels to the table, and as of right now, postdates their evidence, we are draining the funds from not only the offensive, but also the individual leaders that have kept the Houthis together. They don't have any more funds. The United States has exhausted its position. There's not a whole lot more it can do. It's been there for 8 years and has always been on the wrong side of diplomacy. Things haven't come together, so you give peace a chance. You get.
I've seen that problem happen so many times.
Yeah, after 6 rounds, it's just
Josh, is it alright if we sit for Grand Crossfire?
That's all entirely up to you. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, can we take the first question?
Yes, you're welcome to.
Alright, let's start time now.
sure.
Okay. Actually, I don't really have a question. Okay, what exactly has the United States done that has drained the fund of the Houthis? And what evidence do you have that indicates the Houthis don't have funds right now?
Yeah, I got you. Let me read the evidence that I sent you that says that the United States sanctioned the main leader that provided tens of millions of dollars worth of funds to Houthis in cooperation with other rebel groups. That's really important, right? Because that shows not only have we gone after their source of financing, but we've also sanctioned their 2 main military leaders.
Your evidence indicates, or what you read in summary, indicates they don't have any funding at all right now. What evidence indicates that?
Okay, I think
Oh,
Bobby.
yeah, actually, do you want me to read the? I mean, I can send them the evidence, our couple for the web.
Yeah, you can send that if you want
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
But
It
I think,
says-
you know, even like just more big picture, right? Quite frankly, what your story is all about is that the United States needs to sanction, you know, Houthi leaders that are supposedly getting financing and leading this whole charge. But I think that given that this entire past year, we've tried to do that, we literally went after the people that led them and politically held them together, as well as the people that were, you know, ahead of their financing and anyone we could find. I think at this point, it doesn't even come down to like, is the United States willing to sanction them or not? It's that we've done what our intelligence and what we could have figured out, right? Like, let's be realistic here. The United States doesn't know every inner working of the Houthi. So I think the fact that we've gone after the top level leaders is a good indication that we've done what we can. Can I take a question?
Sure.
Awesome. Let's talk about your argument that's kind of, okay, so let's talk about this argument that you all make that's kind of like on our case about how like China's gonna spread like crazy authoritarianism, right? Or what is like the political, I guess, structuring of most Middle Eastern governments?
It's increased recently towards authoritarianism as a result of our Yahya evidence. Our evidence indicates that previously there was a lot of trend towards democratization, right? There were things like the Arab Spring, there were protests, there was trend in governments going democratized. However, the Yahya evidence indicates that very recently in the past year, as a result of increased Chinese influence, we have seen an unprecedented resurgence of autocratic regimes. We have seen more and more authoritarianism, and we have seen countries shifting there because, and the card specifically says this, specifically because of increased Chinese influence. Can I take a question?
So I have a really quick clarification.
I'm gonna take
there.
it.
I mean, I think
We
you guys
just wanna
responded to,
clarify
right?
to
So I
make
just
sure
want to
we don't
clarify
misunderstand.
something.
That's
So I think that what's kind of important to note with the Arab Springs is that a lot of the countries, you know, even post-Arab Springs, some of them were democratic, some of them were monarchs. But after that, majority of countries now in the Middle East tend to follow an authoritarian or monarch regime.
Sure,
So
so
I
you're
think,
not an expert.
wait, if I could like quickly finish speaking, right? I think that what's kind of important is that despite China going into the region, I think the reason why your author concludes that there's more authoritarian regimes is because when two authoritarian countries work together, obviously news sources are going to be like, whoa, there's so much authoritarianism. But given that that was
Wait.
kind of like the fundamental principle
But that's
of
not what it
government,
says. That's not what it says, though. The evidence doesn't say there's two authoritarian regimes working together, and now there's more authoritarianism. No, the evidence says specifically there are more governments in the region that are becoming autocratic from when they were democracies before, and even the governments that were previously autocratic are repressing their citizens more, are cracking down on civil liberties.
Sure,
So we are seeing an increase in repression, increase in authoritarianism. That's what our experts indicate.
And we can send you the evidence. It's really
We
explicit.
can, you know,
Yeah, but
commit
that's
this to speech.
Okay, cool. So we have 45 seconds left of prep time for my final. I'm gonna take that right. Okay, that's it. This speech is just going to kind of go over the main issues of the round. Is anyone not ready? Then time will begin on my first word. They tried to present this round as a false dichotomy between the United States and regionalism, but rather it is the United States versus China. Our argument that if the United States does not fill in, it is China, and their own argument concedes that. But they also concede this. That intel indicates that when China comes in, it increases its brand of authoritarianism through things like internet surveillance, through things like police forces that crack down on civilians. As a result, Yahya 22 explains there has been an unprecedented authoritarian resurgence in the region. We have seen more crackdown on civilians, more authoritarian regimes, a trend away from democratization to authoritarianism, unfortunately. Roast 06 explains that increased Chinese presence means that the chance of civil war goes up by 16 times because of increased authoritarianism. Judge, this is not a battle of the US or nothing. This is a battle of the US versus China, and China on net is worse. So, you affirm to stop the lesser evil. But let's go to the weighing, because this is 100% conceded that China is going in and making things worse. You can also outweigh on magnitude, because it is a big link into the fact that China goes in and makes conflict 16 times more likely. But let's go to our argument about the Houthi heat, because violence is escalating right now in Yemen, and the US is not doing enough. However, the US could reconfigure its sanctions on the Houthi leaders to freeze their funding and make them negotiate. They just say we're draining the funds right now. Their evidence says we sanctioned like 2 commanders. We sanctioned 1 company. Our Johnson evidence indicates we need to go more. We need to increase the amount of pressure to actually drain their funds. They don't bring a single piece of evidence that says the Houthis are done, the Houthis can fight. We say they still can because they still are. That's our Hajj evidence. The impact is really important because if we don't end the war, 1.3 million people will die and 22 million people will experience poverty by 2030. Again, the probability is really clear on this argument. We know the war is increasing right now, it is escalating right now. The only chance of ending it is with US action. But on their case, again, there's too much conceded for them to win the round. The Heller evidence is really explicit. A lack of trust between regional institutions means they cannot exist in the long term, which is why organizations like the GCC have fallen apart, which is why Saudi and Iranian talks have fallen apart. Insofar as the institutions don't trust each other, it cannot exist in the long term. In fact, they concede the prerequisite that the only way for talks is with a United States platform. In order to maintain peace in the long term and to increase United States diplomacy, to put out the fire of firm.
Sorry about the ring.
No worries.
Okay. Judge, just for your reference, I'm going to start on the China argument and then go on to the regionalism argument. Awesome. Let's start on this China argument. There's two fundamental reasons why this is not the argument that wins my opponents the round. First and foremost, they don't tell you at all what China has actually done. Our entire case story has been that China simply went in, funded economic initiatives for these authoritarian countries, and helped boosted their economies. Second, they say, well, all these countries suddenly became authoritarian. They did not name a single example of even one country that switched from democratic to monarch. We say that one news source isn't indicative of anything, given that majority of these countries have historically always been monarchs. Two countries working together and a news source concluding something is not conclusive. Furthermore, you don't know how this affected people, how many people it affected, what countries. There's no specificity, but here's where there is specificity. Our argument about regionalism. The story is quite simple. Because the United States always wants to push its self-interest, it uses forums like the GCC to convince countries to do things that are in its effort. For example, it tells Saudi Arabia to villainize Iran, preventing talks. However, when the United States abdicated the region, what did we see? For the first time in history ever, Saudi Arabia and Iran were at the table talking about how to de-escalate the conflict. Now you might ask yourself, well, what did that accomplish? Here's the thing, these talks have been happening for the past month, and in that past month, Saudi Arabia hasn't escalated in Yemen. Iran hasn't funded any terrorist groups. In fact, that's why our con evidence concludes that terrorism is way lower than it was 6 months ago, and the conflict has declined. Now my opponents get back up and say two things. Well, one, U.S. diplomacy can sanction people. The U.S. Treasury themselves has said that to the best of their intelligence, they've sanctioned the very leaders of the Houthi government and people that have funded tens of millions of dollars. You've taken away the funding, you've taken away the leadership. Clearly, what more can the U.S. do? Let's be realistic, nothing. And second, they talk about, well, dividing interests. Guess what divides interests? An actor that leverages you and tells you to bend to their will. At the end of the day, my opponents spark the fire, help save millions of lives that are being lost in Yemen and across regional conflicts. Negate.
Right one this time.
Right one, there we go.
Good
round, y'all.
Thank you for judging.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you so much, and thanks for entertaining us, judge. This was hands down. I'm not judged last 2 years, or 10. This is the hands down the best one I've ever seen.
Thank you.
So, I guess I give it to the neg. I got confused. I give it to the neg. But having said that, it's not because I think you had it, and then she kind of. You're the best speaker I've ever
Thank
seen.
you. I appreciate it.
So she kind of, your contentions were very good. In fact, I thought you had the most evidence that I've ever seen for AF throughout the last 2 days. They were very specific. They were not vague. It's just that I think the China contention came at the last minute of the debate. I think you guys were more towards sanctions and then kind of pivoted a little bit. So there was a little bit of dilly-dallying around what exactly I'm going after. And then of course Varnika was she can attack all three of our contentions. And your summary was excellent, I would say. I really loved it. I enjoyed it. I'm sorry if I'm not gonna give you a very good I wish you had a better judge to kind of give you more opinion because you guys are really good.
No, we appreciate it. I know it's like a parent, sometimes it can be like confusing and but I really appreciate you taking time out of your day.
I enjoyed it. Really nice. You guys are gonna go really far.
Thank you
It's
so much for
amazing.
your time, Judge.
All four of you.